Day of history and hope.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuhu. Welcome to Open Forum from our MTA International Studios in Bat Rahman. Today, we will talk about gun control, particularly in the United States of America. There are several issues that come up, whether we believe that do guns kill people or do people kill people? That's one argument. There's another argument around in the USA about right to bear arms. And then ultimately, how do we reduce the amount of guns on the streets and whether even that should be a goal? You know, I'd like to show you one chart on the screen right now, which shows that the amount of guns per 100 people, and the black is the highest and the lighter the color is the lowest around the world. What you see on this chart is USA is dark black. There's very few countries that have anywhere near the amount of guns per person than the United States of America. You can see 2 or 3 little smaller countries, dots, but other countries have much fewer guns. And there's other charts I'll show you in a little bit around that. But first, I'd like to introduce our 3 great guests on the show today who will make sense out of all this for us, I hope. First, in the studio, we have Nuruddin Mahmood Ahmed, who is a practicing litigator, which is a lawyer in the United States of America. Welcome to the show, Mahmood.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
Next, we have Noman Ahmed, who is a detective with the New York City Police Department. Welcome to the show, Noman Saab.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me.
Great. And third, we have Itazaz Saib, who is the police officer in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, is not a state, but the actual capital of the United States of America. Itazaz Saab, welcome to the show.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah for having me.
Great. You know, we have 3 great guests. Mahmood Saab, let's start with you. Frame this for us. How should we be thinking about having guns? Who should have them? How many guns should be on the streets? And whether guns actually cause violence? Personally, I am a gun owner. And I would hope to think that I'm a safe gun owner. But how do I make sense out of this?
Sure. So you are one of the 22% of Americans that owns a gun. But interestingly, to give you a sense of how passionate this issue is, there are actually more guns than people in the United States. There are 120 guns for every 100 people in the United States. So there's about a fifth of the population that owns a lot of the guns. And so
a lot of people have multiple guns.
A lot of people
I do
have
not.
multiple guns. Yes. Now, the unique thing, and you highlighted in your opening the statistic around the United States being an outlier, is that the United States, the issue of guns and gun ownership and control on guns is complicated because there are 2 things going on. As a lawyer, I can tell you there is a constitutional argument about whether or not when the founding fathers put in place the frame of the republic in the United States, did they provide for an individual right to own guns? And then there is an issue which our other guests will be able to speak to in more detail about what's actually happening in the real world. What's happening on the streets? How are guns being used? Are they deterring violence or are they actually causing violence? Because there are heated arguments on both sides. And so that
really
complexifies the issue.
Yeah, it's clearly a complex issue. Let's start with Noman Saab. Noman Saab, you're a New York City's finest, New York City police officer for over 20 years. New York City is the largest city in the country. Tell us, and New York City also happens to be less Republican leaning. All the data shows that we have more guns in the South, more guns in more white males own more guns. So there's a lot of data around the demographic of a gun owner. But New York City is the largest city in the country. What is the gun ownership like, and what's the gun violence like as a result of that?
Well, New York City is very, very, very distant from allowing people to have guns, as other states allow people to get guns. New York City has one of the toughest gun control laws in the country. But due to recent changes in laws and a lot of politics leaning very far left, we now actually have a lot more guns that are owned illegally, which is also indicating a rise in a lot more gun violence. That's a result of the illegal ownership of firearms. The primary problem with that stems from the fact that illegally owned guns are owned by individuals that have not gone through the protocols of owning a legal firearm. Background checks being one of them, practice, safety control, etc. Those are the reasons where illegal gun ownership leads to a lot more violence. And the purpose of owning an illegal firearm is an indicator of utilizing that illegally owned gun to conduct illegal activity.
I see. Now, just tell us what. Let me come back to you. Let's go to Itazaz Saab. You work in Washington D.C., our nation's capital. You actually work in a division that's trying to decrease violent crimes in our nation's capital. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing about this.
So right now, as we've been speaking about and the statistics that are on the rise, illegal gun ownership in inner cities, especially in Washington D.C., is a huge increase. The amount of homicides, gun-related homicides in Washington D.C. last year was on the upwards of 200 plus. So that's an alarming rate for the nation's capital. And in comparison to the rest of the country, a lot of violence has been associated with illegal gun ownership. And in the city,
So there's a correlation between illegal gun ownerships and deaths and violence. So that's a subset of gun ownership, correct? I'm just trying to clarify when you say illegal gun ownership versus legal gun ownership.
correct. In Washington D.C., you can now obtain concealed carry weapons licenses, and over 2,000 plus weapons licenses have been issued out. However, there are certain things that you can still get a concealed weapons license even if you have a a kind of blurry black background for a myriad of reasons. But essentially, you can legally own a gun in Washington D.C. But a lot of the violence is stemming from illegal weapons coming into the city and illegal weapons that are now being manufactured.
So
in
tell us,
people's homes.
tell us how you're reducing this illegal weapons. Is there a way to decrease that side of the coin before we talk about the legal weapons?
So there's many different ways to reduce this type of illegal gun ownership. There's certain laws that are passed that medical evaluations can be made, mental health evaluations can be made on people who are legally owning weapons and they shouldn't be based on certain indicators. That's one way. The other way is through street interdiction, different type of operations to remove illegal firearms from the street. The type of work that I've been involved with mainly focuses on the individuals who have pulled the trigger on a gun on more than one occasion, who are currently still violent actors in the city, and basically giving them an opportunity to give them resources that are available to them, whether maybe they need financial assistance, maybe they need help finding a job. And if these avenues they turn away from, then finding where they're legally exposed, whether it's through illegal gun ownership or illegal narcotics activity that they may be involved in the city.
And so illegal gun ownership, there's a clear correlation with violent crimes, whether it's selling narcotics or doing bad things. That seems like it's very clear. Nouman Saab, let's come back to you. How do you decrease the illegal gun ownership in New York City?
Well, it's very similar to what's going on in Washington, D.C. with proactive policing and whatnot. But at the same time, the laws that are in place to prohibit reoffending are now being more laxed, thus causing repeat offenders to come out and act again with illegal weapons.
Okay, that makes sense. Let me come back to you, Mahmoud Saab. So it seems like we have consensus that illegal guns are bad. There are these two gentlemen who are working to reduce illegal guns on the street. We know it leads to violence, but that's probably true anywhere else in the world as well. Mm-hmm. Although our violent death rates in the U.S. are much higher, our gun ownership, as you shared, is much higher. Let's talk. So, would you agree with that? Let's just put that the illegal gun ownership bad. We should decrease that. Is that a fair statement?
I don't think there's much dispute about that statement. I think where it gets trickier is because people will disagree about the causes of illegal gun ownership. And so gun control advocates oftentimes make the point that when you have such lax gun laws as we do in this country, that creates a lot of guns in circulation. And when you don't have licenses as they do, for example, in other parts of the world, there's no control on what's happening to those guns. And so guns can very easily go from legal ownership to illegal ownership. And so it's very easy, for example, for convicted criminals who are not allowed to have guns to buy them on the black market from people who have legally bought them. And so that's what clouds the issue.
So let's talk about that. So I have a Gallup study here. I'll say 48% of Americans would support a law making it illegal to manufacture, sell, or possess semi-automatic firearms. Naman Saab and Itzaz Saab, or Naman Saab first, would you agree with that we should do that? Require at least support a law making it illegal to manufacture or sell or possess semi-automatic firearms, and perhaps you want to explain what a semi-automatic firearm is.
Well, I'll start off with what a semi-automatic gun is. A semi-automatic is a firearm that simultaneously fires shots, as opposed to reclocking a firearm to shoot one bullet. It does it automatically by pulling the trigger. Number two is to make those guns illegal is again a very gray area. There's one side that's heavily weighted against not making them legal, and then there's another side that believes that it's okay to own them as long as.
But you're on the streets. What does the NYPD think?
The NYPD, where we are under the guise of the New York State laws and New York City ordinances, where gun control, no matter what type of gun it is severely enforced. But because, like I said, because of the law changes in the laws, there's a lot more influx of illegal firearms coming in because the repercussions of being, let's just say, arrested for a firearm are not as severe as they were prior, where the crime and gun violence was reduced to very low points.
So, Mahmoud Saab, the right to bear arms. I mean, I'm looking at data here that there's 68% of Americans who believe that stricter gun laws would give too much power to the government over the average citizen. I mean, there's a Second Amendment in the United States around this where I have a right to a gun, and therefore there's all these extrapolations made on that. So, the U.S., by its very founding, has allowed for this. But yet there's a lot of people dying. I mean, there's elementary schools being shot up. I mean, there's a lot of violence. I mean, we've got two great men here who to serve and protect. But what about from a legal standpoint? Can we do anything else? I mean, even after Sandy Hook, which was an elementary school, everyone would have thought a democratic government would have gotten some quote unquote common sense things through, but they can't, because do the American people really believe that everyone should have a gun, no matter what risk? Because guns don't kill people. I mean, the NRA believes that 90% of its members favor reforming our mental health laws versus focusing on guns.
Yeah. So I think the issue is incredibly polarized, and the legal debate has not helped that. So the legal debate, if you go back to the founding, there's a discussion around, was it really intended to be a right for individuals to bear arms in an unlimited way, or was it instead designed to protect, for example, states from being taken over by the federal government? Which is the other side of the argument, is that it was really more of a collective right rather than an individual right. Now, the Supreme Court settled that issue back in 2008 and said that it was an individual right. That remains debated, but at this point, that's the law of the land. The political issue, though, I think is even more...
But can we pause there just for 1 second?
Of course.
Let me throw a chart up on the screen. And you mentioned 2008.
Yep.
And the chart clearly shows that the right to own guns was 30%, and then just a couple of years later, it jumped to 50% to 50-50.
Yep.
What is this chart telling us?
I think it's telling you that the Supreme Court decision settling that issue really changed public opinion for a time. People thought, well, the Supreme Court knows what they're talking about, so there must be an individual right, and that carried through in the public polling. But then I think on the same chart that you're looking at, you're seeing then the support has gone up and down, but waned somewhat over the years. I think that goes back to what you were saying about Sandy Hook and the other school shootings. And one interesting thing is, you mentioned the NRA. The NRA is really, I would say, a diminished organization today compared to even a few years ago. They were recently forced out of the state of New York, where they were originally formed by the state authorities there, and they've lost a lot of support. And so I think that there is a possibility, although this has been said many times before, so I probably could be wrong on this, but there is a possibility that in coming years, there is an opportunity to create some consensus around what people would call maybe sensible gun regulation.
So, but on the flip side, whether that organization stays around or not, but 72% of its members believed when there was a Democratic president, President Obama, that his ultimate goal was to confiscate as many firearms that are currently legal. Let's put the illegal guns aside for a second. So if that was the argument of the Democrats, and I have a right to bear arms, my Constitution allows me to do that. Why shouldn't I be upset about that direction?
So, I mean, there's an incredible disinformation and distrust gap in the country right now. That's not limited to guns, as you know. You had maybe 25% of the population that believed the election was stolen in 2020. And so I think what you're seeing here is something similar, right? Where people have a view that the other party is looking to take away all of their guns, even if that's not actually based in fact. So I think both sides are going to have to work together, in the political arena to try to bridge that trust gap. You're going to need to see political leaders on both sides coming out and saying, we have jointly worked on some type of bipartisan effort to overcome this problem, because otherwise you're not going to overcome that trust gap.
So let me come back to our two of America's finest police officers. How do I transition this to, I understand the politics are complicated, to say the least. Complicated in the sense that we haven't made movement in this, even in the toughest of times. You two go out on the streets every day not knowing who is carrying a gun and who's not. Whereas, say, in London, most police officers don't even carry guns. So as you walk down the street, let's transition this conversation to what should I be thinking of as an individual when I'm walking down the street? How can I protect myself? How can I be safe on these streets? Back to that earlier argument, Sasab, you made around, I'd rather be arrested with a gun than be caught without a gun in a gunfight, kind of an argument. So give me some advice to our individuals at home who aren't polarized, they just want to be safe.
I think the biggest thing is that you should, one, look at the state laws that you live in, the county regulations. You should see what you're legally allowed to do, whether you're allowed to carry a concealed weapon, if you're comfortable with that. I think everyone should be proficient in using a firearm. I think that's a common thing that we should all be able to do. Secondly, when you're getting a firearm for your home, you have to make sure that these things are kept safe. You know how to safely unload and load these type of weapons, and make sure that your family is aware of where they are and how they're safely secured. Secondly, I would say that
on that ownership point, gun owners who died by suicide is a pretty high number as well. So it's not just a matter of me protecting myself from others. Would a gun ownership lead to more people dying from suicide, so that they're a threat to themselves?
I mean, that goes back to that mental health, situation that we were referring to earlier. You have to make sure that you have a mental evaluation. However, you may do that through a licensed professional, and if you're a stable person, individual, and this is something that this is a big responsibility. It's not something light, and if you can take that responsibility, then you should take that step in that direction. But if it's something you can't handle mentally, then you should definitely think twice about that and try to.
Right, you were going to make another point. I cut you off. Go ahead.
The second point would just be that, for safety reasons, if you're ever walking with your family in public, there's a lot of indicators people do that they don't even realize they're doing to show that they are carrying a concealed weapon. And I mentioned one earlier where they kind of blade their body away from you.
Okay.
Let's say if you get in a conflict, a lot of tensions are high these days with a lot of issues that are going on in the country. So, a lot of arguments and things are seen on social media happening in public places. So just be careful the way that, you interact with people, and just look for these indicators where someone may be touching one certain side of their body with their elbow, or maybe when they're walking, only one arm is moving freely and the other one isn't. Or even just heavy objects being protruded from bags. A lot of people carry satchels these days, like those that basically go around carrying in Europe. A lot of people see them now.
Yeah.
Here
So
in the
keep
United
an eye out
States.
for those types of that. That's really helpful. Noman Saab, what do you think? I mean, you see New York City, there's a lot of tourists there as well. I travel a lot, and there's a lot of, I'm sure when tourism picks up more and more going forward, how do I keep safe?
Well, generally, you're safe without a gun. You don't need to be carrying a gun, especially in New York City. That's the way New York City's been. I personally, when I'm not working, don't always carry my gun. I generally feel
Interesting.
safe. But again, it comes back to the point
When you're
of
not working, you don't carry a gun, so you actually feel safe without a gun, and you have every right. I mean, legally, you can carry one.
now it all again comes down to where I'm going to be. If I know that I'm going to be going to a specific area where it's high crime or whatnot, then I'll think twice about carrying it, especially if I have my family with me. When I'm working, yeah, of course I have to carry my
Sure,
gun.
sure. Yeah,
But
but
again, when I'm walking down the street or depending on where I'm living, even in the city, I don't feel the need that I should always carry my gun.
great. That's really helpful. We got a couple minutes left here. And Mutsab, give us your perspective. Tell us where are we going as a nation, the United States of America, and a little bit of forward looking. What if I'm on the side of less guns leads to less violence on this argument? What should I be doing? How do I make sure that I keep safe from a political perspective, not just my individual rights perspective, but as a nation?
Yeah. So I think, look, I think we're at a potential inflection point in the United States on this issue. I think if you look at it politically and you want to make some progress, there really are two key things. One is to try to forge a consensus across political parties on things that everyone agrees on, right? Curbing illegal firearm ownership. How do we keep firearms out of the hands of people who are likely to abuse them, either on their own selves or on others? How do we create better background checks, more sound practices? Kind of just thinking about it from a scientific perspective, trying to find the common ground. I think the other part that goes along with that is that political leaders on both sides of the aisle have to start exercising some prudent common sense and try to de-escalate rather than escalate the situation. You want to project to the other side and say, look, as somebody who might be in favor of gun restrictions, you want to reassure people. You want to say, I understand we live in America. America is not like other countries. In America, we do have a strong sense of individual rights. We do have people who like to hunt. They want to be able to use guns for those purposes. We don't want to take away all the guns. We're simply trying to create more of a common sense climate to protect our children in school, to protect people from suicide and from other bad things that are happening. Conversely, people who are on the other side of the debate, who are in favor of gun rights, they have to take a step back and they have to see that their cause is not being advanced by the epidemic of violence that's occurring, by the school shootings that everyone agrees are non-viable and terrible. And so I think both sides have to look at their basket of issues that they care about, but then think about how can I work together across the aisle? How can I make something happen that will keep my children and the children of others safer, will keep people who have mental health issues from using those guns on themselves? How do I create those incremental positive steps? I think that's, a real possibility that we have in front of us where we might be able to forge some kind of consensus around that. Are there, wins in the other direction? Absolutely. There is an epidemic of disinformation.
It's a
it's a tough road. So I'm not trying to be rosy about it. It's not going to be a walk in the park, but I think there is a
there's
distinct
hope.
possibility.
There's
Yes.
hope. Thank you all to all three of you for being on the show today. You know, we went deep into this topic of gun ownership and gun violence. You heard from our police officers in terms of how do we protect ourselves. If you do want to own a gun, how to do that properly and safely, as well as how do we look at the nation as a whole when there's schools, elementary schools, high schools, where there's these mass shootings, and after which, what can we do about it one way or the other, and still be able to go hunting and still be able to follow the Constitution of the United States of America. I hope this was informative. I hope we all learned a little. I know I learned a lot from our experts on the panel. Until next time, thank you for joining us on Open Forum from our MTA International Studios at Beit Rahman.